All right, guys, welcome back to our teaching in the Gospel of Mark. Now, the last time we were here, we were in chapter 14, and we were dealing with the betrayal and arrest of Jesus by Judas in the Garden of Gethsemane after Jesus's powerful prayer during that particular time, roughly a 3-hour period. And it was Judas who came out with a band of soldiers to arrest Jesus. This band of soldiers constituted people who were of the Sanhedrin, that is, servants, guards of the Sanhedrin, as well as Roman officers too, were acquired by the Sanhedrin. That is, they asked them for their assistance in the arrest of Jesus, as Judas led them to a very private place to the which only the apostles, those closest to Jesus, would have known for Jesus to be. And this fit with the desire of the Sanhedrin, who were seeking to kill Jesus, but they didn't want to do it in such a way that would cause a riot from the people, because many of the people were loyal, or they thought well of Jesus. So this was a perfect and opportune time, and also a time that is chronologically that was tripped by Jesus at the Passover meal, when Jesus told Judas that which he had already purposed to do quickly. And thus Jesus was arrested as Judas led these men out to Jesus, and he gave them a signal. And the signal was one of affection. The one that he would kiss would be the Messiah, and to grab hold to Jesus and grab hold to him fast. And we talked about that in particular, why Judas probably, no doubt, wanted them to hold Jesus fast, because Jesus had already demonstrated a knack for escaping captivity in earlier occasions. But we talked about all of that in our previous video. But nevertheless, so the soldiers took a hold of Jesus, and in doing so, all of the disciples, that is the remaining 11 apostles that were around Jesus, they were alerted because of all of this hoopla. You got a bunch of soldiers coming in at night with short swords and lanterns and lights, and a whole lot of people coming out. So they are literally on alert. And this brings us to Peter. And so what we have is basically the adrenaline is flowing. And so you remember, when the adrenaline flows, you're either in fight or flight mode. And what took over Peter was the fight mode. And so we saw Peter taking a sword, aiming for a man's head, because he was a fisherman and not a professional swordsman, that is, a soldier. He missed and cut off the man's ear. And so in other gospels, Mark didn't get into all of the details, but nevertheless, Jesus commanded him to put up the sword. This was not time to fight. He had to drink the cup that the Father had given him to drink, that is, to face the cross, this crucifixion that was coming for him. And so as they began to cool down, everybody, they fled away. They ran away from Jesus, no doubt, because they were afraid that they themselves would also be arrested. Then we talked about something else very interesting, about another young man who fled away naked, and who the possibility of this young man was. And we believe this one to be John Mark. This is where Jesus had earlier had the Passover celebration in his home, that is, in his Father's home. He being alerted to the events, as he himself was not there initially in the garden with Jesus and the 11, but he coming to see the events, jumping up out of bed without getting properly dressed, with nothing but a sheet over him. What happens? All of a sudden, the soldiers grab a hold to him, and he leaves the sheet and runs away naked. All right. And so now we are going to continue, and we are going to conclude, Lord willing, Mark 14 with it's going to be two things that we're going to see basically working together, but Mark is going to separate them so that we can get a clear picture of what's going on in each instance. The first instance will be the mock trial of Jesus. And when we say a mock trial, we're not talking about a pretense trial, but what we mean by this is an illegal trial. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the details as to why this trial was illegal. That is illegal according to Jewish law. First, it was at night. This was not night trials are illegal in Jewish laws. And then about the coming together of witnesses, the need of the witnesses to agree. And if they don't agree, then you cannot prosecute the individual. But nevertheless, they continued on, even though they didn't have the witnesses. You couldn't force a person to witness against himself. But nevertheless, the high priest did this exact thing with Jesus, and then you could not mistreat the witness. But nevertheless, what do we see? The beating and the mocking of Jesus, the spitting and the hitting upon Jesus, even after he was condemned. And then even so, before the Sanhedrin could give a formal judgment, they had to wait at least 2 or 3 days to give time for consideration, to give time for other witnesses to come in before they declared the judgment. They didn't do any of this. The high priest, as well as the Sanhedrin, declared judgment immediately upon Jesus that night. And the reason we know they did all of these things, they were trying to get Jesus killed as soon as possible. But we know that the providence and the sovereign hand of God was at work. Why? Because Jesus is the true Passover lamb, and that he had to die at the appointed time, not of men's conniving these events together, but as God has pre-purposed these events as well as tying together. So we are still operating within the time clock of God himself, although God is working in the evil workings of men themselves. But nevertheless, this teaches what? The sovereignty of God. But we won't get into all of that. So now let's get it. So the first part, as I said, was the mock trial, the illegal trial of Jesus. Then what Mark does at the end of the chapter is he teaches us about the denial of Peter. And this would be in fulfillment to the word that Jesus had spoken to Peter earlier, how that he would deny Jesus 3 times. Okay, so even though this section is somewhat lengthy in a narrative sense, it shouldn't take that long. It is not a difficult text to deal with. So let us just simply begin. Verse number 53. They led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and scribes gathered together. Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. So he opens up. Now, after, remember, all of the apostles and those who were with Jesus had fled Jesus, and the band of soldiers had taken them away. But Peter had gathered up some courage to follow them at a distance. So Peter, even though he fled initially, we see that he kind of pulled himself together a little bit. And because it was such a large group of people arresting Jesus, it wasn't difficult to follow them in the night. Those hundreds of people with lamps and lights and all of that. Clearly, you can follow them. So Peter followed at a distance, and he came to the place at the Sanhedrin for the high priest. And there, this was this mock trial. That's why we see the high priest is there, the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. These are members of the Sanhedrin. Now, no doubt the complete Sanhedrin was not there. I don't want to get into all of such details, but let me just throw this little nugget at you. Remember, it was Nicodemus, who was himself a member of the Sanhedrin, who himself came to Jesus by night saying, "We know that you must be a teacher who is of God, because no man can do these things except God is with him." So Nicodemus, who later on we know took the body of Jesus. The point is, Nicodemus was not there. So what we do see with the Sanhedrin, all of them are not there. However, those who are there are set upon one mindset, and that is to condemn Jesus, that which they had already purposed to do, to condemn him and have Jesus put to death. They wanted to get rid of their religious rival, their religious problem. And so he says in verse 54, we also see Peter doing what? As we've already said, following them at a distance, and he goes into the courtyard with the rest of the servants, that is the outer part of the house, of the building where they were, and warming himself by a fire, for it was a cool spring night, and Peter was with the rest of the servants and the officers there, as this trial against Jesus was taking place somewhat not too far away. 55. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony. Remember what I told you about that? According to the law of Moses, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, a word had to be established as being true. The witnesses had to agree. Okay, but nevertheless, the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. That's the whole point of it all. And they were not finding any. That's the problem. But for many were giving, what's going on here? So let me do this. So they want to put him to death, and they want to give it a legal veneer that this Jesus is deserving of death, and we have legally and rightfully put him to death according to Jewish law. So we need witnesses. We need someone to bear witness. We need 2 or 3, and their witnesses need to agree. We need them to bring such accusations against Jesus that would be worthy of us, the Sanhedrin, condemning him to death. That's what they were looking for with these witnesses. So they had suborned certain witnesses, but they ran into a problem. The witnesses were not able to agree. And according to Jewish law, if the witnesses could not agree, you could not condemn Jesus. And so this is the issue here. So let's continue. What is the problem? Expanding upon that, 56. For many were giving false testimony against him, but what's the problem? Their testimony was not consistent. Give some examples. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. But not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. And so Mark gives us an example of this inconsistent witnesses against Jesus. Remember in the early ministry of Jesus, when Jesus, this is in the Gospel of John, when Jesus cleared out the temple the first time, and Jesus, knowing that he himself by these very people would be condemned to death and crucified, Jesus made the statement, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. But Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. And so what they did, they misconstrued here in this witness against Jesus. They misconstrued his words to say that Jesus was talking about the temple that Herod, not so much Herod built initially, but it was the great remodeling that Herod undergo, that he had been working on the temple for at least 46 years when Jesus came on the scene. So they tried to attribute Jesus speaking that he will destroy the temple, that is, destroy Judaism as they knew it. But again, what? They still could not get their testimonies of the different witnesses, verse 59, to agree. 60. The high priest stood up and came forward, questioned Jesus, saying, do you not answer? Again, The high priest is now exasperated. He's exhausted with the failed attempts, their own failed attempts in subordinating different witnesses to having a congruent, agreeing testimony against Jesus to put him to death. The high priest and the Sanhedrin have failed thus far. That's what you need to see. Your attempts to have Jesus put to death by getting these people to testify against him has failed. Why? They cannot agree. So now the high priest has become exasperated. He's sick and tired of trying to find witnesses because that's not working. So he turns to Jesus and asks Jesus to testify against himself. And this, again, is contrary to Jewish law. You can't force a witness to testify against himself, especially when you are seeking capital punishment, that is, the death penalty. But nevertheless, this is what the high priest does. So he turns to Jesus saying, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" And notice Jesus responds, but he kept silent, knowing he didn't have to say a word. The onus was upon them. The responsibility to condemn him was not on Jesus, but it was upon the high priest, those who were bringing charges. So Jesus had a right to keep silent, and that's exactly what he did. So again, the high priest pressured Jesus. He continued to pressure Jesus. He questions him, saying what? Saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Now we're going to explain that. And Jesus said, "I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you?" And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Okay, so now let's talk about it. So he continued, the high priest, to pressure Jesus to testify against himself, saying, "Why don't you answer what these people are saying?" But Jesus had a right to remain silent. And so he suborned Jesus literally. And even though Mark doesn't bring it out here, but we do have it in other gospels, he suborned, that is, he put Jesus under oath before God. So this is what's taking place here. "I adjure you before the living God." I put you under oath to answer my question. And what is the question? Are you the Christ? Part one. Part two, the Son of the Blessed One. The reason why he calls it the Blessed One, remember, the Jews did not like to use the name of God. So sometimes they would call him Hashem, that is the name. Here, the reference is to God as the Blessed Ones. So to call him the Son of the Blessed One is a divine title. So number one, are you the Christ? That is the Messiah who is to come. But also two, even as Jesus has been saying throughout his ministry to the people, he questioned Jesus about his divine nature. Are you, in essence, are you the Son of God? That is why it is so important to understand the distinctions between these titles. Christ refers to the humanity. This is the one spoken to be the Son of David who should come into the world, the descendant of David, who will reestablish order, reestablish Israel as the head of nation, bring peace to the world, Christ the Messiah. But the Son of God is a reflection of divinity, one who is equal with God, one who calls himself God. That's what he was asking Jesus. You tell us, is this who you are? And that's when Jesus simply responded succinctly, I am. And not only did Jesus go along with, that is, he affirmed what he was asking him. He doubled and tripled down on the fact of his being the Messiah and the Son of God and of deity. That's why he continued to say, you shall see the Son of Man. Now, this we don't have time to get into in Daniel. I believe that's found in chapter 7, I believe. But Daniel, this is the visions of the Son of Man who comes before the throne of God, and God gives this Son of Man dominion over the kingdoms of the world. This speaks of Jesus' messiahship, him being the Messiah. So you shall see the Son of Man, the Christ, that is Messiah, Christ, same thing, sitting at the right hand of power. Now, that's the issue. That's the problem. The hand of power is God himself. And to sit at the right hand of God, to be seated on the throne of God. Think about what I'm saying. You're seated on God's throne, sitting at God's right hand. Who is qualified to sit on God's throne except God himself? Who can be seated with such proximity of his nearness to God, that is, at the very right hand of God, except God's own equal? You get it? So therefore, Jesus doubled down, tripled down in his affirmation of his deity before the high priest. You ask me if I was Christ, the answer is yes. And you ask me, am I divine, the Son of God? And the answer is yes. And I will one day be seated on God's throne at the very right hand of God himself. And thus we can see now why the high priest acted in the manner that he did. Verse 63, he tore his clothes in an expression of saying, what in the world has Jesus now said about himself? And also to another point, the high priest was forbidden to ever tear his robes, but nevertheless he did. And he said, what further need we have of witnesses? In other words, he breathes a sigh of relief. What happened? Remember, they kept trying to get the witnesses to agree so that they could condemn Jesus to death. That's what they wanted to do. But the witnesses did not agree. The high priest became aggravated because of this failure, and he turns to Jesus to speak against himself, to testify against himself. And Jesus, after the high priest put him under oath, affirmed his words. Jesus answered his question, affirmed his words. I am the Christ. One. Second part, I am the Son of God. So therefore, the high priest is now feeling much better. Why? We don't need witnesses to condemn Jesus. By his own mouth, he has condemned himself. You have heard him speak. And now, what is your judgment? And that's when they said, verse number 64, they heard, notice he said, you have heard, the high priest again, you have heard the blasphemy. Now, what is the blasphemy? And this comes out of the law, to speak ill of the law. That is, to go into some form of idolatry, or to misuse the Lord's name, or to attribute to oneself to be God. This all is a sense of the blasphemy that they are saying, that they are literally here trying to legally attribute to Jesus. So you got to get the point. This is a legal trial. You have heard the blasphemy. And in accordance to Jewish law, the punishment for blasphemy is death. It is death. So he says to the rest of the Sanhedrin, he asks them for a verdict. How does it seem to you? Again, I already told you that was illegal, because what? You had to wait at least 2 days, according to Jewish law, before you even could render a verdict. But he got a verdict immediately in the midst of an emotional event. And this is one of the reasons why there was a wait for the verdict in such cases as these, so that people could cool down, so they could also allow other witnesses to come and try to defend the man. They didn't do that because they had one mindset. They wanted to condemn Jesus to death. And that's why the high priest also said Jesus was guilty of blasphemy. Why? Because this was a thing done that would bring about capital punishment. They could execute you for this. And thus he got just what he wanted, so he thought. And so they all said what? Jesus was deserving of death. And this was the official judgment of the Sanhedrin. Now, what is important to remember before I finish this part is, even though this was the official judgment of the Sanhedrin, it was the religious judgment. Notice they condemned Jesus of blasphemy according to the law, according to Jewish religious law. This was deserving of the death penalty. But they had two problems. Number one, Rome did not permit the Jews to put anybody to death. Rome did not allow the Jewish nation at that time to exercise capital punishment. Thus, this is why they went to Pilate, because they themselves were forbidden to execute Jesus. So they had to turn to the Roman official and get him to execute Jesus. That's number one. However, remember that the Sanhedrin condemned Jesus of a religious infraction, that is, blasphemy against the Jewish God. Now think about this. When it came to Rome, that is Pilate, the governor, a representative of Rome and Roman law, they could give a rat's rear less about the Jewish God and the blasphemy of the Jewish God. That has nothing to do with Roman law. So therefore, the Jews, even after this condemnation of Jesus to death under Roman law, they must come up with a reason under Roman law to have Jesus put to death. So this just overcomes the first hurdle with the Jewish people. The next hurdle that we're going to see in the next chapter is overcoming the second hurdle. That is, under what rule of Roman law should I put this man to death? That will become the question of Pilate. What has he done from the perspective of Rome that is deserving of death? What Roman law did he break? As far as you Jews and you own your own Jewish law, you handle that. But as far as to Roman law, what is the problem that you bring him to me? That will be the issue. Okay, enough said about that. I just wanted you to understand this first hurdle had to do with Jewish law and on what basis they condemned Jesus to death. That is blasphemy, because Jesus called himself the Son of God. He literally affirmed the very question of the high priest. And now the reaction, some, verse 65, began to spit at him. This again, as I told you about illegal treatment of the prisoner, spit at him and to blindfold him and beat him with their fist and say to him, prophesy. And the officers received him with slaps in the face. So here we have basically abuse and the beatings and the ridicule of Jesus by the subordinates. So what did they begin? Even the Sanhedrin to spit in the face is really one of the a low point, if you can let me say it that way. You're really saying something it's a condescending act. It is one of the lowest condescending act. For a person to spit upon you is a low thing, to say you're not worthy of anything. But to spit in the face of Jesus literally is an absolute rejection of him everything that he stands for. And not only that, we see the abuse of Jesus as they began to beat him and slap him in the face. But then you see the blindfold. This is an act of a rhetorical act in such a sense, since Jesus styles himself to be a great prophet. Blindfold him, and so he can't see, as we take turns and slap him in his face and say, now since you are a prophet and you know things, tell us which one of us slapped you in the face. And they all took turns beating and abusing Jesus, and then they just turned Jesus over to the servants. That's what you see at the very end. And the officers received, and the servants, those, remember, the people who were once warming themselves by the fire, and the people who were bringing Jesus in, all of these kind of people involved in this, the servants of the high priest, they began to abuse Jesus as well. Now, let's get to the end of it, dealing with Peter's denial. We want to be brought back to remember when Jesus said to Peter, as they were getting ready to go into the Garden of Gethsemane, this night you all will leave me, for it is written, I will smite the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. And then he told, and Peter, I'll never leave. They may leave you, but I'll never leave. And then he looked at Peter and said, I tell you the truth. All may always be scared when Jesus says, I tell you the truth. Or sometimes you see it in the King James, verily, verily, I say unto you. But nevertheless, you will deny me 3 times before the cock crows twice. So Jesus gave him that powerful awakening revelation. But of course, Peter didn't listen. And remember, in the garden, the last time Peter was there, he was full of adrenaline. He was hot. He was ready to fight for his Lord. But then things cooled off. But nevertheless, Peter mustered up enough courage to follow them at the distance. And the last time we saw Peter, according to this section of Mark, he was standing by the fire on a cold spring night, warming himself with the servants. So now Mark continues as he leads up to the denial of Peter. 66, as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, you also were with Jesus the Nazarene. But he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you're talking about. And he went out onto the porch. And so now we have the situation of the first denial by Peter as he's warming himself by the fire. And notice how it only took a servant girl to affect these issues that are about to take place. That is the denial of Peter of his Lord. So she began to recognize Peter, that he was one of those who were associated in the band of Jesus's following. You were with Jesus the Nazarene. And notice what he said. Peter denied it. And this denial of Peter, what we're going to see is the exacerbated denials of Peter, the exaggerated, the growing denial of. He starts here in a very general and simple, generic denial, somewhat of a distant denial. He says, what? I don't, what in the world are you talking about? I don't know what you talking about. I don't even understand what you're saying and all of that. So this is a very generic denial, a somewhat of a very simple denial, and it begins Peter's motion. I like that too. Notice it said, and he went out unto the porch. In other words, he went further away, even from the place where Jesus's trial took. Do you understand what I'm trying to get to? Not only is he moving further away from the literal place where he once was, a little bit close, not too close, but out there by the fire while Jesus was being interrogated by the Sanhedrin. But now he's moving a little farther away. But in his actual movement of being farther away, he is moving farther away by the very nature of his denial of Jesus. So he continues on. The servant girl, 69, saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, "This is one of them." But again, he denied it. And after a little while, the bystanders were again saying to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean too." But he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man." So here again, remember what I told you. See what? The movement of Peter, the greatness of his denials. So the second time the servant girl came to Peter and says, "You know what? This is one of them." But again, he denied it. Notice the first time was a general denial, in a sense, like, "What you talking about? I don't know what you're saying." Now this denial is a more explicit denial. He just straight denied Jesus. "No, I don't know him." And then after a little while, verse 70, all of a sudden the others who were there began to say, yeah. You were with them. You're one of those Galileans. Now, what's going on with the thing about Galileans? Remember, Judea, that is in Jerusalem, where Jesus was at the time. This is in the south. And where Jesus was from, where he began his ministry, was in Galilee. Galilee is in the north. And those of the north in Galilee had this northern accent. So they were able to determine by the way that Peter was speaking that Peter was not from the south, but he was from the north. He was a Galilean, and thus his speech, his accent was betraying that he was indeed a Galilean, thus believing that he was what? Surely you are a follower of Jesus Christ, because he himself is a Nazarene. He himself is from Galilee. And thus we see the high point of Peter's absolute denial. And this is when it just Peter's absolute break with Jesus. What? He began to curse and to swear. Now, oftentimes, especially people in America or Western countries kind of get this confused about the cursing. They think Peter began to use, some four-letter words and things of that nature. That's not what it means by he began to curse. Peter began to pronounce a curse upon himself. This is what's taking place here. In other words, think of it this way. May God strike me down. May God do this to me. Beginning to bring about and pronounce some sort of a curse. And to swear means he began to use the name of God. In other words, to invoke God's name, that is to swear by God's name, is to say, what I am saying to you is the absolute truth. What is? May God do this to me if I'm not telling you the truth. The truth about what? Notice how he puts it. I like this too. Notice what he said. "I do not know this man." Notice he didn't even call his Lord's name. He didn't even say, "I don't know Jesus." He said, "I don't know this man." So thus, what is Peter doing? He is separating himself as far apart from Jesus as he possibly can. And this is what you need to see in the denials of Peter. They were incremental denials building up to the ultimate denial. First, it was a generic denial. "What you talking about? I don't know what in the world you talking about." Then came the second denial when the girl said, "Yeah, you one of them." And Peter said, "No, I don't know him." Then came the worst and the absolute denial. "May God do this to me." It's kind of like if people would say, I've heard people say this, "I swear before God, this and that." And I swear. This is what Peter was doing. And this became the absolute and total break between Peter and Jesus. That is, in his denials. What Immediately a rooster crowed a second time, verse 72, and Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark to him, before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he began to weep. Now, let me talk about that, our final statement. So immediately the rooster crowed the second time. And in the crowing, so the first time, I don't know, it doesn't talk about the first time in Mark here, but the point is, it's about the second time that Peter came to his mind. It came back to Peter's memory of what Jesus had earlier spoken to him. It was almost like an alarm clock that woke Peter up out of his spiritual apathy that he was experiencing at his distancing. That's what I mean. What he was experiencing at the time, like awake him and said, Peter, don't you remember that Jesus has said that you would do this exact thing? Problem. It's too late. He's already denied him 3 times. And now the rooster has crowed the second time. And now Peter remembers Jesus spoke these very things to him. What? Before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And let me tell you something about the word deny. You see, there's a general word, arnomai, arneomai, which means to deny. And then there is a specific word that is used in the context here. Here in Mark's gospel, and earlier when Jesus spoke to Peter also about the word denial. It is arneomai. What is important? Arneomai is an intense form of arneomai. Arneomai means to deny. Arneomai is that intense meaning of it, to absolutely separate and cut yourself off from me. It almost deals in a sense of absolute rejection. And this is exactly what Peter did. He did not simply deny Jesus, but he denied Jesus even under oath. May God strike me down if I know him, if I'm not telling you the truth. I don't know this man. I swear before God, I don't know. An absolute denial and complete breaking of that connection that he had with Jesus. And when this dawned on Peter that he had done exactly what the Lord said he would do, look at the effect. He began to weep. I like that. This is the only time I want to really get into the Greek where it says ka epibalon. See, that's what I want to talk about that. I want to preach about that. Epibalon. This also deals, balo means to cast. So epibalon comes from a preposition epi that is connected with balo. They're using this in a participial form, but I'm not going to go that much into Greek grammar. But it literally means to bend over. And it's to weep. That is, once Peter came into the realization of just what he had done, that which his Lord had already told him that he would do, he bent over and just almost collapsed and began to weep so much it was uncontrollable. He had miserably failed and betrayed his Lord. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining me with that. Join me next time as we continue on in our study in the Gospel of Mark, as I told you guys earlier. Now what we have already had is the condemnation of Jesus by the religious leaders. But remember, this was the breaking of the religious law, condemned of blasphemy, therefore worthy of the death penalty. Now they need to convince the Roman official to put Jesus to death. And thus the appeal must now be to Roman law. So join us next time as we continue on in our study in the Gospel of Mark as these wretched men move to the Roman official Pilate to try to get them to put Jesus to death. Thanks for joining me, guys. See you next time.